Hello, listeners. Here we are again, back with another episode of Peter and Debra doing a podcast. At some point, Peter, we really do need to think about whether that's the best name. Listeners, we couldn't think of what to call it, so it just felt like let's say what it does on the tin. It's you and me doing a podcast. Anyway, how are you doing, Twinny? How have you been?
Yeah, I'm very well. Good, thank you. Although I did have my first sleepless night last night.
Oh no!
Since giving up the whole kind of CEO responsibility thing, but it's not a terrible story. I was a bit anxious about a really small governance issue in one of the organizations that I'm associated with. So that was rattling around for me a little bit. And I did get back very late last night and had a bowl of shreddies about 10 minutes before I went to bed, which probably didn't do my digestion system any good. But the main reason for my sleeplessness was Laurie the cat, who, since I've been hanging around the house a lot more, has realized that he loves me, or even that I exist. And so when it comes to bedtime now, he insists on getting up and falling asleep on me. And as a selfless charity sector person, I feel at this point that I shouldn't move because the cat will be uncomfortable so I must have, for a couple of hours last night, have been in a very uncomfortable position with my stomach rumbling, worrying away about this ridiculous governance issue, anxious that if I moved a limb too much, the cat would fall off. And I mean, this is ludicrous. This way madness lies, doesn't it? I mean, before I know it, I'll be back to work and living my simple previous life. But so yeah, apologies if I look a bit bleary-eyed, but that's the reason. Otherwise, all good. How about you?
Listen, I feel your pain because I have a massive, as you know, Peter, a massive basset hound called Arthur, who weighs not far short of 7 stone, and he was absolutely convinced he's a lapdog. And I spend most of my evenings with, I can't say the whole of the 7 stone because he's so big, he doesn't get all of me on his lap, but a very large proportion of his head, his upper torso, his feet, like he would try and cram as much himself on my lap as possible. And I don't have a large lap. You know, I'm quite a small human being. And of course, once he's there, I can't move. We have a rule, Andy and I, that the person who has the dog on their lap, which is always me because Andy's tall and skinny and I'm little and round, and so I'm obviously more comfortable for the dog, that the other person has to do all the running around, you know, because you just don't want to move them, do you? You're like, oh, and you feel so privileged that they've come in, that they're just even engaging with you. You know, I know our producer of our podcast, José, also has 2 little Dachshunds who rule his life, him and his wife's life. So we sort of pet, I'm not going to say obsessed, but pet devoted human beings know exactly what it's like when you don't want to disturb the animal. So I feel your pain. I also had a sleepless night last night, though, because in fact, my partner had to wake me up because I had a terrible nightmare. And he was shaking me awake because apparently I was screaming out in my sleep. And I often have nightmares, actually. This particular one, I was being chased by a serial killer with a chainsaw. Don't ask me. Often my dreams involve, you know, murderous intent from others. So I just wonder what hell part of my psyche is this coming from. So I'm also a bit tired and bleary today.
It wasn't Wes Streeting, was it?
It wasn't. Listen, I quite like Wes Streeting, you know. I quite like him. People make mistakes and that's allowed. Anyway, listen, what's been on my mind actually a lot, sort of a kind of a mix of like complete bafflement and laughter, but also fear, is this business of Russia and the USA meeting together to negotiate the future of Ukraine. And I mean, quite apart from, we were talking about it this morning at our DSC check-in with our team, quite apart from the whole sort of childish playground behaviour of these, you know, sort of bully boys, like, you know, we're in our gang and we'll decide for you. It did very much make me think about this whole notion of 2 other groups of people deciding the future of a whole other group of people without that group of people being in the room. And it did, to my shame, it did make me reflect that we still have quite an element of that in our sector, where boards of trustees make decisions on behalf of those that they're serving without necessarily engaging the views or having those people around the table. Like, you know, having boards reflective of the community you're serving is still quite rare in our sector. They're still often made up of the great and the good. I mean, I don't know if you, on your board at NSPCC, Peter, had any actual victims of abuse as trustees, but it's quite rare to see that happen in any sort of charity. So just the parallels really, really struck me about the people with power or perceived power deciding the fate of those who are perceived as powerless. Anyway, I don't know what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, on the NSPC, I mean, we did and do have people on the board who've experienced abuse of different kinds, and sometimes deliberately recruited with that in mind, and sometimes it emerges when the individual has confidence to share their whole self with the rest of the group, if you like. And I agree with you, it is important. And of course, we and the other children's charities spend a lot of time trying to think about how to engage and involve the voices and perspectives of children and young people themselves, not to be dictated to by them, but as you say, they have a really important insight into what it is we're trying to do with and for them. In fact, my predecessor, but one, Dame Mary Marsh, was famous for having a little child's chair in the room, which was somehow or other, I can't remember the exact story, but I know, Victoria Clambier's brother sat on the chair, and Mary would have this chair in her office and for all her meetings, and it represented the voice and the perspective of the young person.
That's so clever.
When I arrived at the job and met her, the first thing she said to me was, you know, have you got the chair? And no idea what happened to it. It's one of those classic lost in transition issues that at some point there was a clear up or a tidy up and nobody knows where it is, but symbolic of something really, really important. I agree.
Yeah. It's interesting because lots of boards that I've worked with really struggle with this notion of lived experience on the board. And what's really struck me about it is that when you start having the conversations with boards about, you know, you need people who are more reflective either of the community that you serve or the community as a whole, they get a bit stuck. And I've been thinking about why is that? Why is it that people get so stuck about lived experience? Because it's a no-brainer for me. But I think it's partly because we've been so socialized as we're growing up to see people with, for example, disabilities or with a different religious background or with a different socioeconomic background as somehow or other being less than, if you know what I mean. And so for example, if you're saying to the Board of Trustees, right, we need to recruit people, you know, from, I don't know, an ethnic minority background in a particular area, they'll often say, yes, we agree, but we need skills, we need ability, we need, you know, experience to be on the board. And there's almost like this assumption that if you have a disability or if you're a person of a different colour, you don't actually have those skills. And this is why when people say we struggle to attract a diverse board, I'm always like, because you're not looking. You know, what you're doing is you're starting from that. We're just assuming that those people are not going to have the skills and ability require. And it's something about like giving people permission to admit that I've been socialized into thinking that, you know, if someone has arthritis or cerebral palsy or whatever the thing is, that they're unable to participate fully in meetings, that they won't have a strategic brain or ability to communicate effectively and all the rest of it. And that we have to like put that completely to one side and say that's just nonsense. You just have to go and look in that pool. And also people get very upset about targets for lived experience or reflective boards. And they're like all resistant about, you know, whether they're going to recruit someone just because they're a black woman or because they're a gay man or because they're whatever. And I was like, no, the whole point about targets is if we've been socialized for so many years throughout our lives in order to have this completely unconscious, in most instances, reaction that it's going to be hard to do because those people are less than in some way. They won't have the skills or the experience. One of the only ways of forcing us to overcome that innate prejudice is to say you must have 5 members on your board with lived experience. That then forces you to go and look 4 or 5 members with lived experience who have the skills that you need on the board. And what happens is you find them. So I'm always very impatient with people who say, it's very difficult to get lived experience on our board, because I'm always saying, because the difficulty is you, not the people you're trying to get to. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
I would add to that if you are weighting a diverse range of characteristics to get really excellent discussions and insights in the conversations you have at board level, you will value those characteristics, even if the individual with the working class background isn't quite such a brilliant accountant as the person who went to private school, but both of whom have a legitimate contribution to make, and that's how a real sort of breakthrough for us with young trustees was valuing youth and perspective, and then developing those kind of trustee level skills around, and having more than one on the board so that they could bounce off one another was really important. At the same time, I can think of, I need to be a bit careful, but just because you have lived experience doesn't necessarily make you a great trustee or ever a good trustee. And people can get fixated on the trustee role being the only legitimate place to have influence in a charity, and I think being imaginative about the nature and the roles and the way in which people can play to their strengths, which might not necessarily be as a team player in collective conversations, but their particular lived experiences of value. There are many other places around a charity that you can draw on that diversity without insisting it has to be at the so-called top table, I think.
Well, no, I see that very differently, Peter. I think we absolutely should insist it's at the top table, because the people out there are very capable. I think it's back to this paradigm that we have, that people who run boards of people who are on boards of charities need to have some kind of professional qualification, need to have some kind of experience in being a board, and it's all nonsense. You really don't need that stuff. What you need is the ability to think strategically, which can happen at whatever level of conversation you have, at what level of experience you've got, or what level, I can't even say my words, whatever level of education. We have this thing that they've got to have certain, skilled professional qualifications and backgrounds. And again, I would argue, but they don't. If you think of the role of a board is to govern, and that governance is about ensuring that the organisation is run in line with the purposes of the charity, that it's following its legal and fiduciary duties, and that its plans are delivering what you want it to. That's actually about asking questions, because, for the vast majority of charities that have employed staff, it's the job of your staff to fulfill all those functions and to give you as a board the information, and your job. So, for example, you think about safeguarding policies. I always say to boards of trustees, don't you dare write one. And don't you dare edit ones that are given to you, because there's a very good chance you'll just put your opinion in it. What you need to do is say, where has the content for the safeguarding policy come from? Is it concurrent with best practice? Has it been checked against legal requirements? And is it in line with our values as an organisation? And it's the job of the trustees to ask those questions, not to write the blooming policy. So I think, again, we're still a bit stuck in this this paradigm about what makes a good trustee. And for me, it's about the ability to ask questions and think strategically, and that anybody can do that. Well, not anybody. Most people can do that with support, though, Peter.
Well, there are some characteristics that make for great trustees, though, aren't there? Like having an open mind and asking questions, like listening, like respecting what other people round the table are saying, and people with lived experience are just as likely
to have those,
even after support, to be there's just as likely to have them, but they're also potentially capable of being hopeless, even with support.
But Peter, as some of the traditional professionally qualified middle-aged rich white men who make up most of our
completely,
who can be absolute arses and absolutely shit trustees, and I've known many of them. So I would just say that it's
I totally agree. I mean, the number of times that I've heard people tell the story of the the male trustee with many of my demographic characteristics saying we haven't got space for a mediocre woman on this board, and someone saying, well, we've got plenty of mediocre men.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Anyway, I think it just goes to us who work in the voluntary sector that whatever's going on in the world, we always find a way to relate it to our sector, and I think obviously the sort of Ukraine situation is way more serious than us just talking about lived experience on boards, and quite frightening, to be honest.
But not having the Ukrainians in the room, and it's dangerous, and difficult, and just adds to the tension and the difficulty of sleeping at night.
Yes, exactly, it really does. I was also sort of on this, thinking about people not being in the room and how dangerous the world is. I don't know if you're aware of this story, but the Telegraph wrote about the Esme Fairbairn Foundation funding a number of different charities, actually, but the one they particularly picked on was the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. And this article was picked up by Elon Musk, and he tweeted something about it, something very scathing in his sort of rude, nasty, Elon Musky sort of way. And of course, what happened was some of his millions of followers immediately piled on. Yeah. And then so I think the Esme Fairbairn has been subjected to some quite large volumes of really horrible online hate, and I think they even got a picture of Caroline Mason and posted it, and that sort of thing. And it's very worrying because most of this is emanating from the States but being amplified in the UK. And I think I spoke to colleagues who are saying like, oh, that's happening overseas, it's not affecting us. And I'm like, well, it is though. Look, because these things are actually happening in our sector. These things are, the Telegraph wrote this letter, and also the fact that there's no fact checking anymore. So the Telegraph, for example, I can't remember what the exact phrasing was, but basically about Esme Fairbairn being taxpayer funding this particular organisation, which is obviously a good organisation that's trying to stop the nastiness that goes around. And of course, Esme Fairbairn isn't a tax funded organisation. It's a very different setup as a charity. In fact, I think Esme Fairbairn's largely endowments, if I remember rightly. Anyway, so I don't even think they fundraise. I mean, I'd have to check my facts on that. So, it's just, and it's like the real concern about the sort of the unfettered nature and how damaging it is to the people that we serve. I mean, of course, we've spoken about this on more than one occasion, the online safety bill, for example, protecting children and young people, but it's actually spread, the damage it can cause to adults and human beings. The
scale and the speed with which everyone piles into something is incredible, isn't it? I mean, the criticism of so-called loony grants is a very traditional fodder for the tabloid press. I mean, I started at the Big Lottery Fund, as it was then called, in 2008, and they were still reeling from Daily Mail exposés many years previously about grants to Peruvian farmers for guinea pig rearing, and this was your kind of classic crazy lottery grant, and it was a story which every 6 months would get regurgitated, even though the grant was years and years old, and even though there'd been a kind of careful explanation of the development value of helping farmers in this poor part of Peru breed guinea pigs for eating, which is what happened over there, to give these people a kind of livelihood and a leg up. But all of that was lost. And 5 years later, when I left, having never made any awards to any Peruvian guinea pig farmers, my gifts were still guinea pig themed. I've got a guinea pig apron with a recipe for how to cook a guinea pig. So this is long-standing, Daily Mail tradition. It's a very easy story to write when you pick and choose from development grants, isn't it? And I see Elon Musk was doing that as well, including millions of condoms to Gaza, though it turned out it was Gaza in Mozambique and not Gaza in the West Bank, to which he just said, oh well, I'm going to make mistakes from time to time. But by then
the story's
distortion
out.
has become a truth. So yeah, tough times for funders, and it's really important to be clear and principled about your awards. At the same time, I'm absolutely sure that if I went and had a look at all the awards that had been made by lottery distributors over the last couple of years, there'd be some with some crazy grant titles. I think we used to have someone who would go through all the awards before they were made to try and
change the title,
reduce the provocative nature of the grant title, which the charities really like because it attracts attention to the issue.
And it's not only that, it's this kind of notion is that, I genuinely think that part of the job of a grant maker is to fund high risk, highly,
unpopular, if you can't get the money from anywhere else.
Absolutely. It's like, I think that's a duty, actually, if I'm honest. Not necessarily for all of the money to go in that direction, but we're never going to get change in the world if we don't take risks and if grant makers can't take the risk. So I'm proud of the times when the lottery has just said, oh, sod it, we're going to fund it anyway and we'll take the flak when it comes our way, because it doesn't, I'm not so sure that's been the case of the last few years, but certainly under your leadership, Peter, you did tend not to be too swayed by public opinion.
Yeah, but a lot of time and effort has been put in down the ages from the early days of the lottery to desensitize for those reasons in a way that someone at USAID hadn't quite done on their great long lists of grants. So it's difficult. But then also I think isn't it a fact of life as a leader? I think you've got to expect now your profile and personal details to be out there, anyone's kind of fair game, and if you're not using that to promote your cause, you're missing out as well. But it does feel very David and Goliath-esque when you've got one person who owns the site and has millions and millions of followers saying one thing and you're the leader of a tiny organization.
It's very, I think that's very often underappreciated about chief executives. And we get all the time, they're rubbish at management, they're leading toxic organizations, they're not ahead of the game, they're not focusing on this, that, and the other. And there's very little recognition of how vulnerable, it's the least safe job in many ways to have. You're much more likely to lose your job as a chief executive than you ever are to lose it as another employee. There are much fewer jobs available to you if you do lose your job, and much more competition for those jobs. So it's quite, I'm not saying that in, to make people feel sorry for those of us who are chief execs, but I think people don't realise you carry the weight and the burden, you're the figurehead, you're the subject of hate. We just had at DSC one of our policy meetings with some of our board to talk about DSC's positions on things and stance and how does the board want us to progress, actions around certain things. And one of the trustees did say, that I'm probably, Debra, the most vulnerable person in the organisation because I am the figurehead, because my board want me to say things like they say it more, say it louder, say it stronger, swear more. They really get it out there, Debra. They want me to do that, and I'm really happy to do that because that aligns with what I want. But nonetheless, it does put me in quite a vulnerable place of, saying things that perhaps other people aren't saying and that sort of thing. So it's just interesting thinking about. Then I suddenly came out of the policy meeting feeling very vulnerable.
Oh, but
I've forgotten how much people can hate me.
but of course, the flip side of that is you've had a explicit discussion with your trustees and the people around you about what they want and need you to do. So you are in a much more robust position than someone who comes in as a leader and just thinks, "Oh, I'm going to say this or that." No, clearing your context is.
Oh, my board, they're absolutely brilliant. They don't police everything. We have 4 core policy principles that have been agreed over the years, and we stick within those things that we think are the right. So that they we have discussions for input and all the rest of it, and they will kind of encourage and things like that. But they don't try and fetter us, if you know what I mean. It's not like we have to pass everything I say for their approval because we've sort of agreed the parameters. But it's a good point, an important one. those of you chief execs out there, if you're engaging with and communicating with your boards effectively, you'd be surprised how often they will be up for you saying more. But you have to engage them so that they feel safe. Because I think, again, as chief execs, what you forget is that I'm a reflection of my board, and that if anything goes horribly wrong at DOC, it'll be the board in the firing line, the board who gets criticised, the board that gets hauled up in front of the Charity Commission or, you know, whatever. And so I think we as chief execs have got to be cognizant of that, is that, you know, if our boards are the ones who carry the can, not us, and it's really okay for them to worry about what we say and where we say it and how we say it.
Yeah. And then equally, they need to appreciate that from time to time, we will be out on the airwaves and asked a direct question, which deserves a direct answer, or it will be counterproductive if you completely fudge it. And so a bit of kind of retrofitting after the event to explain why the answer was consistent with the policy discussions they've had previously. I think it's really helpful when the board can acknowledge and understand and appreciate that in this kind of hurly-burly, fast-moving media world we're in at the moment, you can't simply
talk wait for approval
in lines that were agreed by the policy committee at their last meeting, you know, 2-3 months ago. I remember us having a really brilliant conversation at the NSPCC policy committee years ago now about the age of criminal responsibility.
All right.
Which varies around the world, but there's quite often it's relatively low in England. So that every now and again you'll get a parliamentary motion or backbenchers suggestion to move it up to 14 or 16, or so. Our trustees had an amazingly interesting kind of conversation from all sorts of perspectives about, and of course the whole thing is really nuanced and dependent on context, and people had experiences of young people who were behaving in criminal situations, but was that as a consequence of the context rather than themselves, or had they grown up fast? When is a murderer not a murderer? And they argued themselves right round in circles to a kind of point where they agreed that the line should be that the age of criminal responsibility should be higher than it is at the moment. So I said, well, that's really helpful. It's a really interesting conversation. And actually, all that kind of nuance and context is very helpful to me, should I be asked this question on the Today programme. But actually, that's not a very good answer to John Humphreys or Andrew Neil or whatever, and it doesn't directly answer the question: do you or do you not support a backbencher's a private member's bill that says the age of criminal responsibility should be
whatever
16?
Yes. It is funny how that's such a good point, Peter, and such a good thing is these things are so often extra. But people want clear answers, and I also think that's actually okay. So listen, we're coming to the end of our time, but I just wanted to end this by sort of doing a bit of fangirling. So I was absolutely made up, Peter, to see that Simon Lancaster had commented about our podcast on your LinkedIn page, and of course I'm a big fan of Simon Lancaster. I've read his book. How Language Works, or I can't remember, How Language Works, Why Words Kill, which I don't know if you've seen it, but it's got the Matisse picture on the front with the bowler hat. Is it Matisse? I think it is. And I just absolutely loved the book. I thought you're going to go and get it now, aren't you?
Yeah.
I thought it was just brilliant. And I quote from it all the time. I think that's the one. Yeah, mind.
You are not human.
Brilliant. You are not human. That's it. Why language matters and how words kill, or something like that, isn't it? Just absolutely fantastic. And of course, he liked and commented on our podcast and said it was brilliant. And it absolutely made my day. I was like, oh my goodness. It's nice when people like it, but when somebody you admire, and you sort of think they wouldn't know who you are from Adam, and all of a sudden they say something. Anyway, so I just wanted to end on a sort of feeling good about us, Peter, and our podcast, because somebody I admire has liked it.
That's very good. Yeah, no, we love Simon. He does brilliant. He writes brilliant books and does brilliant speech writing. courses. And You Are Not Human is a really good book, and it has a section about language involving children, including some observations made by Peter Wanless, chief executive of the NSPCC, and contrasting the fact that it took 60 years after the RSPCA was set up to create the NSPCC. Because as a nation, we seem to care about animals, including my cat and your dog, more than we do children.
About children.
And on that note...
Yes, on that note, we say goodbye for this week.
Yeah, very good to see you.
For listening, and you too. And see you again same time next week.
Bye.
Bye.